So thank you for attending the specially designed instruction session today for new teachers as part of our new and emerging teacher cadre. Today, we're really going to talk about what is specially designed instruction and some of the characteristics of specially designed instruction, why we use that method for designing our instruction, what makes it special for our children. And then we're going to look at some examples of specially designed instruction and then resources that you can use in your classroom as you work with students. So for our first activity, as we just begin, think about what you know or what you already have some idea about what is specially designed instruction. Do you know, think about it. So just take, 30 seconds and think about what is your definition. If I ask you today to define what specially designed instruction is, just, think about it for 30 seconds. And then I'm going to ask you to put that definition into the chat. So let me give everybody 30 seconds and just make some notes on that. Okay. So now that
we do, I'm sorry, we do have one that started already.
Okay,
so,
great. If you don't mind to read those, Chastity.
We have one so far, and I'll read that one while we're waiting for the other ones to come in. It said it's specific per student.
And that's right. It is specific. That's what we're doing special for that student. In addition to what all the other students receive. So that was a good one. Specific for that student. Any others?
We do tailored instruction for each student to help reach their goal.
That's great. That's a term that John O'Connor uses when he talks about specially designed instruction, that they're tailored. So that's great. It is what we focus on. We tailor that instruction to meet that individual student's need. It's very specific because when we have a student that's been identified with a disability, then we know that there are certain areas that they struggle, that they have an adverse effect. And so we have a goal in those areas. And if a child has a goal, a reading, writing, math, behavior goal, then we know that we have to do something special to address that need. So that's what makes this instruction particularly designed for that individual student. So here's the federal definition. So it is adapting, and we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about those three pieces here. We're adapting as appropriate the content, the adapting the methodology or our delivery of instruction. The big goal is that we want to ensure that a child with a disability does have access to the general curriculum. So we want to make sure that children have access. And so in the way we do that is through the way we deliver instruction. And so this slide here is a slide that comes from the Kentucky Department of Education. And so this is kind of just thinking about how we move kids. What does that mean around adapting? What does that look like when we're talking about the content? What does that look like with our method? And so those are really the three areas that we think about, because we want to make sure that we address the individual need of that child. And so I just like to use this child because I like if we look at access, and I like that small icon in the bottom, if you'll see on the bottom right hand of the screen, different children need different things. One child, to be equal, may need a couple different steps. One child needs one step and one doesn't need anything at all. But what we're not just saying everybody gets the same thing. We're saying that equity means that we give kids what they need. But again, remember that it's access. We want to make sure that kids have access to general curriculum. So this slide has a lot of information on it, but it's such a good information. So when we start thinking about the content, that's what we teach, the contents. That's our Kentucky academic standards. It's what the expectation is that we teach for that grade level. And so the only time, and I'm going to ask you all this, when do you think, or when would we adapt, or when would we change or modify the curriculum or the standard? When would we do that? And what population of students would we do that for? Anybody want to venture a guess? So let's think about students who are on alternate assessment. let's think about, we have the Kentucky Academic Standards, and then we look at the Kentucky Academic Standards, and then we adjust those standards for those students, so they become they have targets for alternate assessment targets. So that's what we mean when we're talking about modifying the content. We'd reduce the breadth and depth of those standards, but we're still giving those students that expectation for that standard. We just reduce it to some extent to make it accessible for those children. So for any other time, we don't really adapt the content, because what we're supposed to teach is the Kentucky Academic Standards. So that's the thing we have to just remember. We don't generally adapt the content, because we have to think about what we do, what materials we use, the way we teach students, how we assess where kids are at. And so when we think about writing an IEP, we have to write an IEP goal that's based on standards, where we're wanting students to move to, because our whole goal in special education is for students to have access to grade level standards. So we don't ever want to reduce that to lower that expectation. We want to continue to make those standards available to students and engage them in that learning. The other thing that we do then is, then we need to really think about the method. How do we teach students? So the method is how we deliver that instruction. And so, that's where we talk about all the time, using a direct instruction or explicit instruction. And so that is when we really focus on, how do we make sure that this child gets what they need? So, that might be, using multisensory approaches, that might be using visual supports. It might be chunking information. It might be breaking down a standard and a skill into much smaller sections, and then allowing students to be able to do that in smaller chunks. And so again, that doesn't change the standard. So we still have that grade level expectation. We just break that down into smaller steps. We give them a tool or a resource to help them along the way, such as a graphic organizer, but this gets back to our conversation, and we'll talk about it some more today. We have to know the difference between what our instruction is and what we are just accommodating, right? So there's a difference, and we're going to talk about that some more in a second. But, if we're giving students supports when we're providing instruction, we have to teach them how to use those tools or supports. And that's part of our method. So when we think about method, we just think about the method we're going to use to teach students. Then the next one is the delivery. And that's the who, the where, and the when. And so here's where we're talking about who is it that how we're going to deliver that instruction. Are we going to use technology as tools? Where are we going to have those services provided? Is it going to be in the general ed classroom with a co-teacher? Are we going to pull students out in the resource room? And so you may have several students in one grade level, but some of them need to be in the co-teaching general ed setting. Some of them need to be in the resource room. Some of them need a little extra time in the resource room. Again, that goes back to the part that's the individual. We have to make sure that's individualized for each student. So we don't want to generalize across and just say, we have 6 students in one grade and they all get co-teaching. Or we say 6 students in the 5th grade, we're going to put them all in the resource room. It's really about deciding where they need the support, because we've identified the areas where they need help, and that's where we put our time and effort. So we think about how we deliver that. And then we think about, what do they need? Do we need it in a large group? Are they going to need some individual supports? And so again, those are how we think about specially designed instruction. And for us that have used thinking about those goals, sometimes when we look at that goal and we write a goal for a child, and there's so many things to choose from around what specially designed instruction is, that we might click some buttons to think that matches with the goal, but we really want to think through, what is it that the instruction that this child needs? And so that helps us to make decisions. So I'm going to flip on through and talk just a little bit more, but here's some, just talking about those specific things. So those 3 things: are we adapting the content? Are we adapting our method? Or are we adapting our delivery of instruction? So let's start talking about, what does that mean to adapt the content? Remember, we talked about that just a minute ago. We don't want to just necessarily break down the content and adapt the content, but what we want to do is to think about ways that we get kids access to content. Are there some alternative text or leveled text that we can have kids use to give them access to that information? And we were talking about just a little earlier, if you think about like one of the standards for us is in like informational standard in reading, for example, and I'll just use reading as an example. But one of the things is that, one of the standards says that we have to talk about how a character changes in a story. How, in third grade, it's talking about what their traits are, what their motivations are, what their actions or feelings are. And then they want to see how that impacts the story. So the older you get, then it wants to talk about those factors and then how that changes, how they change over the course of the text. So, second and third grade, it looks like this, but by the time they get in middle school or high school, then it starts really looking at how this character changes over the course of a text. And so if we want to really understand that, and that's the skill we want kids to know, is to understand the development of a character. That's the skill. And so we can use appropriate leveled text or text that we can give them access. Sometimes we call that high interest, low readability text. And if we're reading Romeo and Juliet, then we can maybe use a text that has the information. The standard says that we have to think about how a character develops over the course of a text. So we're not changing the standard, but we might use some of the materials that would give them access to understanding that. We're still teaching that skill, but we could use those books. And so the other thing, we don't want to, we can think about chunking some of the content, but look at that third bullet. We think about that fourth bullet, does the students need lower level standards? Now we don't lower the standards, but we might have to back up and look at what the standards look at for a grade level before. So sometimes people get a little bit confused about that piece. We're not kind of reducing the standard. We're looking at what that standard says and what skills kids have, and then we're looking backwards to see about where are they at. And then we start looking at what they're required in that standard, and then we start building their skills based on that. So when we think about that adapt, we're really, again, just making sure that we only are doing that for students that are in those small populations, and it's a real small percentage of students. Otherwise, we're making sure that kids still get to that skill. Now, let's talk about the method. So this is how we are teaching students. And here's just some more information. We might give them, we might use, if kids are having trouble with phonics or phonemic awareness, we might use a multisensory approach, right? So that's how we adapt how we use the method. So rather than just using all auditory or visual things in the classroom to teach them, we start integrating things like sand trays or bead strings or tools that they could do that would reach their learning style. Again, we were talking about this a little earlier, but how do we change the method? How do we chunk material? If it's a multi-step problem you're solving in math and you need to solve multiple steps, how about we break that down into step one, a step one, let's learn how to do this piece. How about we move to step two, we break that down. We might give them bead strings or algebra tiles, or we might give them number lines, or we might give them base 10 blocks, right? We use that and we break them down into smaller pieces. We're not changing what they learn, but we're breaking it down into smaller pieces that they know. That's that scaffolding. That's how we make a smaller chunk of that. And thinking about scaffolding. So, and I like this one. So if you think about the scaffolding, and you can think about either kids writing a 5-paragraph essay, or you can think about teaching kids how to write a paragraph. Well, instead of saying, okay, go write a paragraph, let's teach them first how to write the thesis statement, or let's have the introductory sentence, right? And then let's teach them how to give 3 ideas that they're going to discuss in their essay, and then a transition statement moving into their paragraph. But we break that down into much, much smaller pieces, and we give that information to them as a scaffold. So we teach them one thing, and then we work on that for a little bit, and then we teach them the next piece, so that they're getting access to the content, but just in little small chunks or in small steps. Because sometimes kids they have to learn this piece first, and then you build a little bit on that, and then you build a little bit more on that. And you can do that across any content area. So this wouldn't just be reading, it can be for writing, it can be for math. The same thing if you're trying to apply the same strategies for social studies and science, it's still the same thing, breaking down that big concept into little small steps. And so once they learn one piece, so you can't write a paragraph if you don't know how to write your first sentence, or you don't know how to write your thesis sentence. So, you may have to spend some time teaching them how to write a thesis sentence. And then you might have to, help them figure out how to articulate that and put that into writing. So you may spend some more time on that. And then, coming up with their 3 big pieces. That's going to take some more time to work on that. But again, that's what we're going to do. We're going to give them that instruction. We're going to give them in small chunks, let them practice it, lots and lots of practice turns and feedback. And we give them practice and we give them some feedback and practice and feedback, so that we're not just jumping in and saying, write that whole paragraph, because probably our students are having trouble writing that whole paragraph. But again, that's how we kind of build up their writing stamina, and that's kind of how we build it up, so that eventually we want them to write that whole 5-paragraph essay, right? Or we want them to be able to complete a writing prompt on an assessment. And it might be that we give them a checklist. If a kid's having trouble with let's say grammar, or they're having trouble with capitalization, we might give them a little checklist so that they can check, do I have all the spelling? Do I make sure I have all the capital letters in the sentence? Do I have a period at each sentence, or do I have some kind of way to measure, did I get it right or did I not? So again, that's thinking about how we change the way we teach. Now, this one says, how do we change the way we deliver it? So if you'll see this comment at the top, it says no law, there's not a law on this, but it should be different than what's being done in the regular classroom. Because if they were able to get it in the regular classroom, they would be able to move on, but they can't work. They don't have the supports or the skills that they need to do it in the regular classroom. That's why it becomes a need for specially designed instruction. So that's when we have to use the way we teach them, very explicit. And I can remember back when I really didn't know the difference between what explicit instruction is, or direct instruction, or strategies instruction, because there's so many different ways to teach kids. But for us, it helps us to make sure we know what explicit instruction is, and what does that mean, and what does that look like. We have to think about our kids who struggle the most, need more opportunities to practice. And we need to give them as many chances to practice what they've learned as we can, but we also need to be able to give them feedback. We want to be able to say, give them a skill to practice, and then give them an opportunity to respond, and then tell them very specifically, this is, not just yes or no, but why did they get it right, or where did they make the error? So for special ed kids, they need more and more and more practice with examples and opportunities. So we also want them to have to recall information. So we can use mnemonics, we can use graphic organizers, we can use metacognitive. So there's different ways that we can do it. So it's important for us as special ed teachers to understand the different ways to do that. And we got to know the difference between what specially designed instruction is, and what modifications are, and what accommodations are. So, because those are all really important. Those are a lot of words that we use in special ed a lot, and maybe we don't have enough time to talk about what those should be and how to divide those up. So what I would challenge you to do for this is to just go back and think about what the definition of SDI is. What is accommodations? What are modifications? And to make it clear for us. And then as we help because we're then working with regular ed teachers, and those kids are going to spend a lot of their day in the regular ed classroom. So about 80% of our special ed kids, 66% of our special education students spend 80% or more of the day in the regular ed setting. So if we've got them in that regular ed setting, we really have to give them the supports that they need to be able to be successful. And so thinking about how we do that and how we deliver instruction is important when we think about that, because there's going to be times we got to teach them the skills to be successful, because we're not going to be in that room with them all the time. We're not going to be always given instruction or supports. So it's important that we teach them how to monitor their own learning, or how to understand some skills, or how to understand or access content. We also have to think about, differences among kids, how fast that they learn, their processing speed. So another thing you would want to think about is, if you have some students on your caseload and you're thinking about what areas is their disability, do they have a cognitive deficit? Like, are they MMD or are they FMD, or do they have a learning disability, or are they have another health impairment or an emotional behavior disorder? Because those are all important to know when you're thinking about how to design instruction for kids. Because if a child has a cognitive deficit and they have trouble with their working memory or their processing speed, that's how you know to just so you say, oh, okay, so if they're having trouble with their working memory, they're not going to be able to hold a bunch of steps in their mind. They're going to have a skill or a strategy to help them do that. If they have visual spatial issues, they're not going to be able to copy all those notes off the board when their teachers are giving notes. So knowing that, you can say, oh, so my student really needs help with that. So maybe I could use an instructional strategy like structured notes. And that means I'd give them a little bit of the notes ahead of time and I'd just let them fill in the blanks. Or I would give them a strategy for note taking. So, and I would teach them how to take notes using that strategy. I might use Cornell notes and I might teach them how to use that. So when you're not with them in that classroom, then you would still be able to, they would still be able to use that skill you taught them in any class. Because they're going to have to take notes in science. They're going to have to do note taking in social studies. They're going to have to do some note taking in math. So when we're thinking about how we're teaching kids, the method and the delivery, we think about how do we make sure we give that support to those kids, each individual student. So let's talk about then on this page, we're really talking about why do we use specially designed instruction? And so this is the reason we do it. We want to look at the goals. So we want to address the unique needs of the student, and we know what their needs are because we've went through their assessments. We know their formal assessments and their evaluation, but we also know how well what their classroom assessments are. We know how well they performed. We've also looked at baseline, and we figured out where the students are working at. So then we've developed goals for students based on what their needs are and what areas they need support on. And so in order to do that, we have to teach them. And this helps us address our goals. And we look at how often and how frequent that we need to meet to provide instruction to students to make sure that they are on track to be able to meet their goal. And when we think about, we don't want to just we want a good, ambitious goal for students. We don't want them to just keep them on a second grade reading level forever. And then next year they get a second grade reading level. And the third year they get a second grade reading level for a reading goal, right? We want to make sure that we are moving students and that we're ambitious with that, and that we want them to make progress. So we always are thinking about how do we move kids as far as we can on that goal from the time that we have them until, that next year that we meet. So, we get confused sometimes about what specially designed instruction is and then providing accommodations. And so recently we started working with teachers to talk about what's the difference. What is it that we're doing to accommodate, or what are we doing to provide specially designed instruction? And so we had teachers that we were talking about what specially designed instruction, and they maybe would say, we use a graphic organizer. Well, if we give kids a graphic organizer and we don't teach them how to use them, that's really an accommodation, right? Because we're just accommodating them with a way to organize their information. But it becomes special because it's instruction that we design specific for that student for a specific skill. And we have to teach them. And so sometimes that's where we're missing it at, is the teaching of the tool or resource. So we want to think about, we have to think about making sure that we keep kids in those inclusive classrooms, but we give them practices to help them access grade level content, and we have high expectation for them. So we just have to think about that. So one of the things that we've talked about is when we started looking at our data around this region on gaps for kids, and we started looking at how some of our schools are targeted, or like TSI or CSI, and we found that a lot of them are are in that status because they're subpopulation for students with disabilities. And we also know that based on our data that our students our students with IEPs are not proficient. We have some pretty low numbers. I think our proficiency rate for students in math is about 12% at 8th grade math, which means that there's about 88% of those students that are novice or apprentice. And so where's the gaps? And that's where we're starting to look at. So one of the things that we can do to change the gaps is the way we deliver instruction in those classrooms. And we do that through specially designed instruction. And we do that because we know what specially designed instruction is and then what accommodations are. So this slide came from Ann Benninghoff, and she gave us permission to use this. But this kind of connects really all those things that we've been talking about. That's the what, why we adapt the content, methodology, delivery. Why? Because we have to meet those individual needs of students. We've got to give them access to the curriculum, and we really want them to have access to standards, grade level standards. Again, if I'm always shooting for 2nd grade and I'm in the 4th or 5th grade, I'm never going to make the progress I need to. And so over in the top right-hand corner, you can see what specially designed instruction is. It's special, it's connected to the goal. We monitor it, we monitor the instruction, and we can generalize that. And it helps students be able to be on their own. Just like we were talking about, if we teach them how to use a tool, then they can use that tool. But if we just give them a tool, we're just giving them accommodation. We are not, tools for accommodations are like a graphic organizer or extended time or focus tools or note-taking guides. Those are just accommodations. Those are not instruction. And so we have to think about what we're doing each time as we're providing those supports for students. And in the center, you'll see this targeted icon, and you can see all kids get that outside. That's what all kids get in the general curriculum, and they get that universal design for learning. So we want to design our lessons around having that whole design for all kids to have access to it. And then that next layer is that differentiated instruction. How do we make it different for kids? And so more kids may need that. Then you move into that tiered support through MTSS. Then you see that it's much, much more targeted. That center, that's the SDI, that's our students with disabilities. And that's the students who need specially designed instruction. That's why they need it, so that they can access the curriculum. So you see, not everybody needs that, but you can see kind of how that moves toward much smaller targeted group for SDI. We'll move on to the next one. Now we're going to do an activity. So I hope you all have been paying attention. We're going to do a little activity for this next section. Let's just talk about these are on this slide here. And I want you to decide, is this a specially designed instruction or is it not SDI? Is a graphic organizer SDI? No, a graphic organizer, unless you're teaching them. Can it be specially designed instruction? Yes. If you just give them an organizer, a T-chart, or you just give them a sheet that's got some science terms on it and you have them fill it in, is that special for that child? Probably not. But if you give a child a structured notes page and you teach them how to fill that in, and then you scaffold that to start reducing what you do with them, but you give them a way to organize their information and you teach them how to use it, it would be a yes. Otherwise, it's no. And sometimes we go in there on that drop-down menu when we write a goal and we use graphic organizer. It's important to know if we're going to move it, if we're going to move students to proficiency with their accommodations, we got to know the difference about how we're teaching them or we're just providing them a sheet of paper. All right, next one. Extra white space on a test. Is that specially designed instruction? Yes or no?
No, because there's no specific instruction.
Excellent. That's exactly correct. So I'm going to move just a little more quickly through these. What about preferential seating? Is that specially designed instruction? So is preferential seating, you think that is a SDI? Are we teaching, are we using, how are we using that? And that would be the question I would ask, is how are we using preferential seating? Are we using that to accommodate students because they need to be closer to the board or they need less distractions? If so, that would be an accommodation, right? Not an SDI. How about a printed version of the slides? And I like this one because when I was in the classroom, I would try to get a printed version of the slides sometimes for my kids that were having trouble note taking. Is that SDI or is that accommodation? Okay, so if we just give them a printed version of the slides, what are we doing? We're just giving them a printed version of the slides. But why would we do that? What would make that special, or what would make that instructional about that? If we were chunking it and we were taking slide 1, 2, and 3, and we were taking that and breaking that down into small steps and practicing with those, then that might be specially designed instruction because we were breaking that down into chunks, or we were helping them to analyze that or to use that content and in smaller, more frequent opportunities. But if it's just a copy of the slides, we're just accommodating. If you look at partially completed notes, so a minute ago I mentioned those. We sometimes would use structured notes, and that means I'd give a kid some notes that were partially filled in, and they needed. So let's say I had a student one time that had he was had trouble with visual spatial, so he couldn't get notes copied down from the board. And so by the time he'd get a note copied down, the teacher was on to something else. So he was so far behind the whole entire class, he couldn't learn because he just couldn't keep up. But so if I gave him part of the notes and I just had him write in the targeted words as the teacher went along, is that SDI or is that accommodation? So what happens sometimes is we kind of get a little worried because it's a little bit confusing between what's SDI and what's accommodation modification. But if I give a student partially completed notes and I'm having them write the key words, because I went ahead and looked at the notes and I pre-planned for what my students might need, or I'm in the classroom and I'm helping them get their notes down and I might have that for them, partially completed notes. My purpose is either I'm teaching them to find the key words or the critical components of the note taken, and I'm not giving them all. I'm teaching them how to filter what's just the most important, and then I'm going to scaffold that. And so first time I'm going to give them notes that just have a lot of just a few blanks in it, right? And I have them complete it. But I'm planning to eventually reduce the number of filled in blanks. And I'm going to reduce that to have shorter, less. I'm going to require them to do more, and I'm going to have less supports for them. So that's what I'm going to reduce that scaffold. I'm going to plan to take that away, and I'm going to do that by taking a little bit away each time that I give them that notes, right? Because what I'm teaching them to do is to do note taking, and I'm teaching them to be independent note takers. So when I'm not there with them in science class or social studies, or I'm not there all of reading class, or I'm not there in math class, they know how to do it on their own, because I'm always planning for how am I making that child independent. I'm not just putting a student in special education to keep them in there forever. I'm thinking about how am I going to move them out of special ed? How am I going to give them everything they need to be independent and successful on their own?
We do have an observation.
Okay.
And it was Michael had shared that he said that all of these seem to be accommodations unless you are providing that in specialized instruction with these.
That's right.
With the things that you
absolutely
have listed. So,
and that's exactly correct, Michael, because you could debate every one of these on this list, and that's kind of part of the intention of how we always do this activity. There's a reason the reason we do it, and how we introduce it, and how we teach it to the child, and the way we have them transfer that learning makes a difference, whether it's SDI or accommodations. But when we ask teachers, even special education teachers, we say, what do you spend most of your time doing when you're in the classroom? If you're in the co-teaching classroom, what are you doing most of the time? Are you getting to do specially designed instruction, or are you accommodating? So I can share with you what the general response to that is. Most of the time we're accommodating. We're just providing accommodations. And so if we're going to move kids, we have got to provide the instruction. So it's important that as special ed teachers, we are the ones responsible for giving that initial specially designed instruction. right? That's our responsibility as special ed teachers. But it's also, we have to think about why we've created that. If we're using a partially completed notes or a structured notes page, the regular ed teacher and the special ed teacher need to be knowing why we're doing that and why we're helping that student with that. So again, when you're not there, those students still have access to those tools and resources that they need to be successful. Again, if we're not teaching them that and we're just giving them accommodations, we're just reading to them all the time, or we're just giving them a graphic organizer, or we're just giving them a word bank all the time of words to use, we're not teaching them. We're not going to help them move. So we really, really have to think about the instruction. And we go back to what John O'Connor says, because he wrote the book, Great Instruction, Great Achievement for Students with Disabilities. And what he said is, we don't have control over lots of other factors that happen in the classroom all the time. We don't have control over the factors like, who they live with, what they wear to school, none of those things. But the thing that we as teachers do have 100% control of is instruction. And so we shift to thinking about how important instruction is. It's so important that we are providing kids with disabilities. They're the ones that need the most support. They're the ones that need the most attention to examples and non-examples and practices and feedback from the teacher. Those kids need the most support. So we want to pair up us that we want to give them as much support as they can. And sometimes special ed kids, and you've probably seen this too, but in the classroom, the special ed kids are the ones that don't ever answer the questions. The special ed kids are the ones that put their head down, or they don't engage in the conversation because they don't know the answer, or maybe you're not able to respond that quickly. And so we think about our instruction and how we make sure that we get all kids responding in the class, because that gives our special ed kids lots of opportunity to practice. And if we do activities around that, then we can monitor whether they're getting it or not. But sometimes we flip that upside down, and our kids that need the most help get the least amount of help because they're the least engaged in the work. So just knowing that we make sure that we intentionally plan for instruction that's special for those children, that's in addition to what everybody else gets. And that's the thing we have to remember. We don't want to spend our resource time doing homework, right? We don't want to spend our time doing that, because our job when they're in the resource room is to making sure that we are addressing those goals, and we're giving kids instruction on the area that they need, because we know they need it, because we've proven through their eligibility that it has an adverse effect, that it's their disability is impacting their learning. And in order for us to help them, we've got to make sure that we give them what they need. So these are just some questions to think about for when you're thinking about specially designed instruction. It's always got to be special for that kid. Is it different than what everybody else is getting? Are we giving them support because they have a specific, unique need? And if you got 20 kids on your caseload, you got 20 kids that's got different needs, right? We can't just say they all need readers or they all need reading, right? We might look at accommodations for that, but if we're teaching them, we have kids that are visual learners, we have kids that are auditory learners, we have kids that are kinesthetic learners. So we have to make sure we know our kids well enough to know what kind of learner are they? What kind of instruction do they need? If they're having trouble in math, do they understand? Do they have a conceptual understanding? Can they understand concepts? If it's vocabulary. So we just really need to know our kids. We need to know their learning styles. We need to know what they're pretty good at, and we need to know what they are having trouble in. And we know that because we put together an IEP. Right? We put together a plan for that child, or a program for that child, that says this is what this kid needs and these are their goals. And all the time we're checking. We're making sure that what we're doing around our specially designed instruction is connected to that goal, because we wrote a goal. This IEP team has come together and we've developed goals to make sure that the student can be successful. And we got to check. We got to keep checking to see if they're making progress on that. And then we always have to ask ourselves, is this a tool that we're using for specially designed instruction, or we accommodate? So every day in our instruction, you just ask yourself, does this more of accommodation? Am I giving them a tool, or some way to access, or am I teaching them? Are we doing it intentionally? Are we focusing on what they need? Are we teaching them a skill that they can apply in other settings? And so, I know I was thinking about when I was in the classroom, I might teach a kid how to use, maybe we used a Venn diagram, right? And we would compare in reading. So I taught reading, and we can compare two characters in the story. And so I teach them using a Venn diagram. And so I'm using a graphic organizer as my SDI, and I'm teaching them how to understand what, characteristics of one character, and then characteristics of another character, and then what do they have in common. So I'm teaching them how to use a graphic organizer, right? I say that I'm using specially designed instruction, and I'm using a Venn diagram, and I'm teaching them that in order to analyze characters, because that's the skill I want them to be able to do. Okay, so then they go to social studies, and they're comparing two different events in history. I want them to have that same skill, right? Because the skill I'm teaching them is to be able to compare and contrast between two things. So I want them to be able to use that skill no matter what class they're in. Or if I'm in a, if I'm thinking about, and I'm doing ecosystems, because I'm teaching some science standards. And I want kids to think about two different ecosystems, and then I want them to think about those common elements between them both. I want them to be able to use that Venn diagram I taught them to be able to generalize that. So it should work in science, it should work in math, it should work in social studies. It should work in any area when they're trying to have to compare and contrast or identify similarities and differences between two different things. Because I want them to be able to go do that on their own. So next year, I want them to be able to use that organizer to organize the way they think. And the year after that, then they may not even need that organizer because they've mastered that skill. But everything that I do and whatever I'm working on, I want to make sure that that is designed to help them move forward and become independent learners. And so this one is telling us what is specially designed instruction in reading. And there are such good resources on here. There's a brand new specially designed instruction tool that's been developed by the state special ed cooperative, the Special Education Regional Technical Assistance Centers, or we call ourselves CERTECs. We're technical assistants through the cooperatives. And so here's the SDI reading tool. And so you'll have access to this. And I'm just going to show it to you just real quickly. But this tool gives you, let's see, this one gives you an idea about strategies and about what you do with interventions. And if kids are having trouble in certain areas, then they can access this particular tool. So back to this slide, we have made available for you resources for reading, writing, math, and behavior. And writing, for a lot of us, writing is hard to get a baseline and to be able to figure out what specially designed instruction to provide and then how to progress monitor it. So there's some great resources here with the writing tool. Or right here is a raft strategy. And this one tells us how to use the raft strategy, right? And so this one tells us what the role is of the writer, the audience, the format, and topic. So when we're talking about using a mnemonic or an organizer, we're talking about specifically using those in order to teach students how to be, how to write. So this one is one for helping them be able to write and how to write for a particular audience. So we can use a strategy like RAFT in order to be able to teach our students. So that becomes specially designed instruction. We're giving them a way to organize their thinking and to use strategies to do that. And I won't go through all of them just for the sake of time, but there's one for math. And, these are models around like specially designed instruction. And what do we do for students in areas of mathematics? What if a kid has trouble with an area of concern in being able to count numbers or being able to count forward and backward? Well, here's some resources to help kids with that. So here's some things on that. And these links again are available to you. This comes from the Kentucky Department of Education. And if you'll see kind of down here in the bottom right-hand corner, it comes from the IEP and Lesson Plan Development Handbook. And this is with the Kentucky Department of Education. And on this link right up here in the top left-hand corner gives you the IEP lesson book that takes you to that handbook. So if you're kind of stuck on what does a student need around specially designed instruction and what does that look like, then you can click that and it will take you to all kinds of resources, just like we have shared right here on this sheet, about what you can do as you're thinking about how do I match what I'm doing special with my instruction to the goal that my student has. And then how do I measure that? How do I make sure they're getting it? And so those are good tools to use. And we want to make that available to you all so that you can go back and access those later on, because it's a lot of information today, but these are for you to go back and look through anytime you have some time. So just to review, specially designed instruction should have high leverage practices and evidence-based practices. So we want to make sure that we choose, when we're teaching kids with specially designed instruction, that there's some research behind it. And specially designed instructions, what the teacher does to instruct and allow students to have access, and how we teach and reteach and monitor how well they're doing in the general education curriculum. And if we know that it's required that we teach specially designed instruction, then we use that so kids can have access to materials and resources. But those are then become specially designed instruction. Again, if it's an instructional material, if it's something we just use and give them, it's not an instructional resource. If we teach them how to use it, then it's an instructional resource, and it's SDI. And that helps it for special ed teachers and regular ed teachers. We all need to know what the difference is so that we're providing instruction. Again, we control 100% of our instruction. And that is one way we can move students to proficiency. Even our IEP kids, and we can hold them all to high expectations and plan for how we're going to move them as close as we can and move them as to grade level as the best that we can. Thank you for being here with us.